Hello. All right. So, just a quick review from our last podcast in the series. We talked a bit about the rise of Japan and Korea, revolutions and reforms in Latin America, revolutions in Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, as well as the Arab Israeli conflict. And we concluded with talking about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the formation of new nation states, as well as the genocide against Bosnian Muslims. So we're going to pick up today and move on to begin the discussion of global political change. And our first focus is going to be on Africa. Democracy had mixed results. The South African government used apartheid to keep the white elites in power and Black Africans in poverty and political powerlessness. The Bantustan system was created to keep Black Africans divided by tribal identity and poverty. In the 1970s, a new generation of Black leaders emerged. By 1983, Black South Africans had organized the United Democratic Front. And in 1986, the U.S. Congress had overridden President Reagan's veto. And they passed a bill that limited trade and investment in South Africa because the world had had enough. And this was a way for the U.S. to try to convince the South African government to end their policy of apartheid. To an extent, it did work. South African government had released Nelson Mandela in 1990, and Mandela spent almost 30 years in jail. He was convicted of being a terrorist. Now, I'd like to mention, if you don't know who Nelson Mandela is, his crime was he was fighting for equality. He never committed a violent act in his life, but the government viewed him as a threat. And they viewed him as a threat because he was a very bright young man. He was also somebody that could unite the people of Africa, and that's what he does. Because Mandela is released in 1990, and he is elected president of South Africa in 1994 in the first free election. Mandela was a member of the African National Congress, also called the ANC. And when he took office, he faced immense challenges. And the first thing he has to do is unite the people in the country. And there's a number of movies about Mandela you can watch. A Long Walk to Freedom, and Invictus are two of them. There's great books. The book Mandela wrote himself as well. But what you need to know about Mandela is he was a very forgiving man, and he took office with the goal of uniting everybody. He forgave the people who forced him to spend almost 30 years of his life in jail. Aside from the problems of uniting his people under one nation, poverty plagued South Africa, but he also faced immense challenges involving the spread of HIV and AIDS. Although Southern Africa has enjoyed progress and a decline in armed conflict since 1991, other areas of Africa suffered from political instability and destructive civil wars. Ethnic cleansing would be one of the issues that dramatically impacts Africa. And we'll start with the Rwandan genocide. The genocide had its origins in Germany's and after World War I, Belgium's imperial policies. Belgium officials showed a preference to the Tutsi tribe over the Hutus. And in 1994, the Rwandan president's plane was shot down. A Tutsi army then invaded and took over the government. Between April 7th to mid-July 1994, an estimated 800,000 Rwandans were killed. And what happens is after the Tutsi army rises up, you then have the Hutu forces that rise up. And the majority of the people living in Rwanda belong to the Hutu tribe. And as the Hutus begin attacking and killing Tutsis, but also people of the Hutu tribe who were Tutsi sympathizers. 100 days, 800,000 people. More than 2 million Rwandans became refugees in an attempt to escape the conflict. And to break the numbers down a bit more, 70% of the Tutsi population were killed in 100 days. And that was actually 20% of Rwanda's total population. We will watch Hotel Rwanda in class, but what needs to be said is the world knew what was happening in Rwanda, and the world did nothing. The world stood by and let it happen. And when you are watching Hotel Rwanda, you will see United Nations peacekeepers being brought in, and this shows the weaknesses of the UN and how they really cannot get involved in conflicts or choose not to get involved in conflicts. In 1998, violence spread into the Congo. And in the Congo, the rule of President Mobutu, who was actually a dictator, ended after 3 decades. However, this fighting, this revolution, and the civil war that broke out by 2003 led to the deaths of more than 3 million Congolese. And that's from warfare, disease, and malnutrition. And this is called the Second Congo War. It began in August of 1998 in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it takes place a little more than a year after the First Congo War and involves some of the same issues. The war officially ended in July of 2003 when the transitional government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo took power. And although a peace agreement was signed in 2002, violence continued in many regions of the country. It's named as the deadliest war in modern African history because the Second Congo War has directly involved 9 African countries, as well as approximately 20 separately armed groups. By 2008, the war and its aftermath had caused 5.4 million deaths, mostly through disease and starvation. And that makes the Second Congo War the deadliest conflict worldwide since World War II. Despite a formal end of the war in July of 2003 and an agreement to create a government of national unity, 1,000 people died daily in 2004 from easily preventable cases of malnutrition and disease. All right. So one thing we're going to talk about is population growth. And I want you to take a look at the chart for a minute. I'm also not entirely sure why that map of the Gulf War was there. So go back and look at it if you need to. But demographic transition. The population of Europe almost doubled between 1850 and 1914. And while some Europeans saw this as a blessing, you guys remember Thomas Malthus, he had argued in the early 1800s that unchecked population growth would outstrip food production. In the years immediately following World War II, Malthus's views were dismissed as Europe and other industrial societies experienced demographic transition to lower fertility rates and reduced mortality. The demographic transition did not occur in the Third World, where some leaders actively promoted large families until the economic shocks of the 1970s and 80s convinced the governments of developing countries to abandon the pro-natalist policy. The world population exploded in the 20th century, with most of the growth taking place in the poorest nations. But there was also a rise in mortality in some of the same regions as well. The rise in mortality will be directly related as the AIDS virus and HIV virus spread. Demographic pyramids generated by demographers illustrate the profound change in human reproductive patterns and life expectancy since 1945. The developed nations facing aging populations and eventually will have to rely on immigration or increased use of technology, including robots, can't wait for that one, to maintain industrial and agricultural production at levels sufficient to support the relatively high standards of living and the generous social welfare programs. So if you ever wondered why there's a lot of expos that involve robots and all the magic that robots can do, now you know why. The computers will take over. They will rise up and defeat us all. The developing nations have relatively young and rapidly growing populations, but they face the problem of providing the people with education and jobs while struggling with shortages of investment capital and poor transportation and communication networks. In the developed industrial nations of Western Europe and Japan, at the beginning of the 21st century, higher levels of female education and employment, the material values of consumer culture, and access to contraception and abortion have combined to produce lower fertility levels. Low fertility levels combined with improved life expectancy will lead to an increasing number of retirees who will rely on a relatively smaller number of working adults to pay for their social services. In the 21st century, the industrialized nations will continue to fall behind the developing nations as a percentage of world population. At current rates, 95% of all future population growth will be in developing regions, particularly in Africa and Muslim-dominated countries. In Asia, the populations of China and India continue to grow despite government efforts to reduce family size. It is not clear whether or not the nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America will experience the demographic transition seen in the industrialized countries. Now, demographics and projected population growths and plans, that is an entire field of study that you can get into. One I am not A, familiar with, or B, confident in my knowledge to go on beyond what I'm saying here. So if you have questions, please, by all means, A, find somebody who can give you the answer, or B, Google it. Sorry, guys, but I have absolutely no problem admitting that I am not good at this topic. Moving on. Since 1945, the global economy has created unprecedented levels of material abundance because we are living in a material world, and we are all material girls and boys. At the same time, the industrialized nations in the Northern Hemisphere have come to enjoy a larger share of the world's wealth than they did a century ago. That being said, the majority of the world lives in poverty. Regional inequalities within nations also have growth in both the industrial countries and in developing nations. Migration from rural areas to urban centers in the developing world increased threefold from 1925 to 1950s and accelerated rapidly after 1950. This is also still a trend in our society today. Migrants to the cities generally enjoyed higher incomes and better standards of living than they would have in the countryside. But as the scale of rural to urban migration grew, these benefits became a bit more elusive. Migration placed impossible burdens on basic services and led to an increase in slums and crimes in the cities of the developing world. Migration from the developing world to developed nations increased substantially after 1960, and this led to an increase in racial and ethnic tensions in the host nations. Immigrants from the developing nations brought the host nations the same benefits that the migration of Europeans brought to the Americas a century before. Immigrant communities in Europe and the US are generally made up of young adults and tend to have fertility rates higher than the rates of the host populations. In the long run, this will lead to increases in population in Europe and the US, and to cultural conflicts over the definitions of citizenship and nationality. So here, again, projected average annual of growth rate. This is an entire field you can get into, but between 2000 and 2050, populations will grow, or will there be a population loss? So you might want to freeze this just to look at it. Pretty impressive population gain. 2.5% or more, or going all the way from a negative 0.5. So we're looking at increases all the way to decreases. And the world's largest city. So we're looking at 13 million or more people. And in 1970, there were two, Tokyo and New York. My favorite, though, is that Tokyo stays number one, always. Someday I'll get there. But New York, number two, and then drops to number 4, and then drops to number 6. And you'll also notice we've got New York, and Los Angeles Take a look, guys. Globalization is coming. All right, we're going to finish up today with technological and environmental changes. New technologies developed during World War II, and this increases productivity. It reduces the labor requirements. Again, the machines are taking over. And improve the flow of information when they were applied to industry in the post-war period. Improvements in existing technology accounted for much of the world's productivity increases during the 1950s and 60s. The improvement and widespread application of the computer was particularly significant because it transformed office work and manufacturing. Transnational corporations became the primary agents of these technological changes. In the post-World War II years, transnational corporations with multinational ownership and management became increasingly powerful and were able to escape the controls imposed by national governments by shifting or threatening to shift production from one country to another. In the 1960s, environmental activists and political leaders began warning about the environmental consequences of population growth, industrialization, and the expansion of agriculture onto marginal lands. Environmental degradation was a problem in both the developed and developing countries. It was especially severe in the former Soviet Union. In attempting to address environmental issues, the industrialized countries faced a contradiction between environmental protection and the desire to maintain rates of economic growth that depended on the consumption of goods and resources. In the developing world, population growth led to extreme environmental pressure as forests were felled and marginal land developed to expand food production, and this led to erosion and water pollution. The governments of the US, Japan, and the European community took a number of initiatives to preserve and protect the environment in the 1970s. Environmental awareness spread by means of the media and grassroots political movements, and most nations in the developed world enforced strict anti-pollution laws and sponsored massive recycling efforts. These efforts, many of them made possible by new technology, produced significant results. But in the developing world, population pressures and weak governments were major obstacles to effective environmental policies. We will spend quite a bit of time in our final chapter next week talking about ways that governments tried to reduce pollution, protect the environment, because global warming and climate change are real, folks. It is real. Just saying. Yesterday, it was a beautiful 75 degrees in February. And today, it's significantly colder, and a massive piece of hail just bounced itself off of my window. Good times. Anyway, in conclusion, water stress. And you might want to pause, review our final points. If you have any questions, you know what to do. Send me an email. Don't forget, guys, RECYCLE, recycle, conserve, and don't pollute. Because we get one Earth, and once it's gone, we'll either A, be living on Mars, or B, living like mole people underground. Have a good one, folks. Cheers.